So that was US President Donald Trump talking at the Republican National Committee buildings today, an auspicious day for him and for all Americans as they head to the polls to finally wrap up the US presidential election 2020. And to discuss this, I'm joined live from the US by Mark Meirowitz. Mark, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm wondering whether half of your room is painted blue and the other half red today. No message there, I'm sure. Upbeat words from Donald Trump, sounding a little bit raspy after days of campaigning. We're in the final leg now. Do you think, as he's suggested, that it can be wrapped up today, or is it going to linger on?
Many differing opinions on that. I mean, clearly, it's unlikely that it'll be wrapped up today. And the reason for that is the completely disparate rules on counting the ballots. Example, well, there was a Supreme Court case involving Wisconsin where the U.S. Supreme Court required or overturned a federal judge who tried to extend the time in which ballots could be received in the state. And it has to be received by Election Day. But in Pennsylvania, for example, the state Supreme Court allowed the ballots to arrive at election offices by Friday night, even without a legible postmark. And by the way, that's an invitation to litigation. Michigan also has delays. All the states are delayed, and also, which is very important, is that, for example, in Florida, all the counties have separate boards of election. In Wisconsin, the local boards of election. We have many, many different systems for doing this, and the number of ballots is so overwhelming, including the early voting ballots, absentee ballots, that it's very unlikely that it'll be wrapped up today. I don't think so. Although the numbers right now, at least I'm reading for the New York Post right now from today's edition, the numbers they're working with are 125 electoral votes for Trump, for Biden 216, and undecided 197. Now, just very quickly on the Electoral College, the total number of electoral votes is 538. The majority is 270. Those numbers, if they're correct, indicate we really can't tell where it's going. The president's very upbeat, very optimistic, but obviously it's those swing states, those key states that he mentioned, Texas, Arizona, Florida, which are pivotal. And we know from the election in 2000, there was litigation in Florida. And now the president's also talking about how it's unfair to have this procedure. The Republicans are going back to court in Pennsylvania. They're going to court all over the place. Right. So if the president doesn't win outright, and again, when you say win, again, those numbers need to be certified. And there's a whole procedure in the law where the electoral votes, and again, just very, very quickly, each state receives the number of electoral votes really indicative of their population. So California has 55 electoral votes, Montana has 1, and let's say New York is about 27. So it's proportional to their population. In order to get the electoral votes, except in 2 states, you need to win the most popular votes. So winner takes all. This is a very tricky thing, especially when you have counting of ballots so late, delayed by these procedures that are completely different in every state. And I would also say that COVID obviously complicates this tremendously in terms of people being able to go to the polls. Although, from what I've been hearing from my students, they're going to the polls and waiting for hours to vote. I voted absentee, but the polls seem to be very, very busy with large amounts of turnout. So what the president is trying to hope for is that and he believes the mail-in ballots are predominantly Democratic, so he's trying to suppress or to stop the ability of all of these mail ballots to come cascading in, and for a loss, he wants to have those invalidated. So there's still potential for litigation all the way up to the Supreme Court, like we saw in Florida. By the way, when you mentioned about the incumbent, I don't think would be the first incumbent president not to be reelected. President Ford, President Carter, George Bush, you did mention, John Adams, Andrew Johnson. He wouldn't be the first, and I don't think there's any shame in it, honestly. Served as president for 4 years. If he gets another another term, then, that would certainly be a wonderful thing, or Biden would become president. So when you say Trump or Biden, that's your headline. The American people are looking to a satisfactory and peaceful resolution of this debate,
And in fact,
and moving on to the future.
And in fact, as Trump just said, one of the important things is that America comes together. Obviously, this whole campaign, which seems to have started 4 years ago after the inauguration in 2017, this campaign seems to have dragged on interminably. And of course, in the last 6 months, we've talked about almost nothing but. For the last few weeks, we were very concerned about the world's been very concerned about the postal votes. I've been reading that in many places, 80 or 90% of those votes have been delivered successfully. Over 100 million people have voted early. This surely shows a very high turnout, which must make any predictions even harder to make.
Well, I wouldn't give up completely on our Postal Service Board of Elections. A lot of the systems that they have in place are very, very advanced and are able to handle large numbers of ballots. I was listening to one discussion where they're talking about a system that they have in one state. The ballots are open, the ballots are checked, the ballots are counted. There's technology for this. So I wouldn't give up on that. It's American know-how, which usually saves the day. But I think the problem here is how it turns out, and the delay in the mailings, where you basically, in New York, for example, you can actually get your ballot in quite a number of days later. This was done by the state legislature. So when does it settle itself out? And as you said, the incredible number of mail ballots, absentee ballots, of course, makes the system very, very difficult and could lead to litigation, because the litigation is not necessarily about the processing of it. It's whether or not it's legally valid to accept a ballot after Election Day with a postmarked before Election Day. And that would seem to be a no-brainer. But apparently the Republicans feel this is a fraudulent or improper. And, and I have to say a nuance of law, because the Constitution does delegate to the state legislatures the power to run the elections, not the federal government. The problem in Wisconsin was that there was a federal judge who said you can have an extension. The Supreme Court said a federal judge cannot make the decision. It's up to state legislature. So that's what's happening in Pennsylvania. So you have a melange, a hodgepodge of legal challenges all around the country, and we could end up, remember, in 2000, Andy, Florida was one state, and because of the issue of how it was counted in the recount, was pivotal in the result where George Bush won the election. So here we don't have just one state where there's an issue where there's litigation. We have multiple states which are being contested. So we have the potential for confusion. By the way, that doesn't even count to the Electoral College and how that proceeds, because that proceeds once you need to figure out who won the electoral votes. Those need to be sent to Congress, and then Congress has a joint session on January 6th where they count the electoral votes. And there's a potential there for protest. In 2016 election, there were protests against the electoral vote. In 2017 in January, when they counted the votes in the joint session of Congress. The only hitch there was that you need a House member and a Senate member to contest it. And only House members contested it, arguing that there was Russian hacking and all sorts of fraud. But that didn't go anywhere because there was no senator, and these were Democrats. Now, with the polarization that you talked about and how we have been on this complete roller coaster of polarization and confusion, it's possible that even if we get to the point that we have the electoral votes in that beautiful wooden box and start counting them, that we will have protests. Look, unheard of that the Democrats in the Judiciary Committee walked out of the meeting when they were going to decide on Amy Coney Barrett. And then when they took it to the floor, the senators against it put a thumbs down and walked out. This is a new level of, let us say, not civic respect and democracy. So I would say that this election, and again, I use the roller coaster, we're on a we're on a roller. I don't know if they have roller coasters in Turkey. I'm not really sure, but you know, but my point is that we're on a very fraught and difficult situation here, and we don't know. And the problem is we don't know where we're going with this. And what complicates it, obviously, is the COVID, and that is the pivotal issue that changed this whole political campaign, because the economy was very good, and Trump, you know, I would have said had it sewn up at that point, and then the COVID came and smashed the economy, right? And then we also had the domestic unrest in this country, and then we had the Amy Coney Barrett nomination right before the election. So, and of course, Obamacare and health care coming up for a Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade. We just have exacerbated tensions and polarization to a point which is, and it's not unheard of in American history that this has happened, but COVID, we haven't had experiencing a pandemic. We actually, believe it or not, have experienced an impeachment of a president, a hearing on a conviction which was not convicted. Then we had the COVID. Then we had the Supreme Court nominations. Americans have had to contend with shock after shock after shock in terms of tranquility. And then, of course, the riots and the domestic unrest really made everything worse and made people concerned. And people are home and they're worried. So all around, the American society is in turmoil. So when it's in turmoil, we do need a resolution of this election. But whether we're going to get one soon, I'm not so sure that we will. But, you know, and I would say I saw predictions from one professor who was on C-SPAN, Washington Journal, and he said he's predicted every election since 1980 or so. And he,
in fact, I spoke to him. Yes.
Was that Alan Lichtman you're talking about?
Yes.
I don't know if. Yes. So Alan Lichtman has predicted every election for years, and he has 13 indicators. And he said that he predicted Trump in 2016, which was pretty incredible because most people didn't see it at all. And he predicts Biden for this election. So, you know, people could be wrong. He could be wrong, or he could be right. We don't know. So again, we're living in a world of uncertainty. I'm sure there are people running all sorts of algorithms and numbers and complexities, but if you look at the lines are amazing, unprecedented. The rallies, too, the president is right to talk about the rallies, but the question is, he has his base, that's his rallies, but has he swayed other outside his base? That's always been the problem. I'm looking at the numbers here in the Post, and those numbers are hard to forecast. I mean, I think American politics is unpredictable. The American people will decide. You know, I think there's a poem by Robert Frost. Yes, the people. Yes, the people. The people will decide. It's not the popular vote. It's the Electoral College. And, you know, again, depending on how this turns out, it could, again, reduce, our confidence in the Electoral College. But the truth of the matter is the Electoral College, if you look at it carefully, really protects the interests of smaller states. Because if you had a popular vote, you would not, the smaller states would not count at all, because they only have a few popular. So, in other words, we want to dismantle, Americans talk about dismantling everything we have. But I think this election is pivotal to understand, do our institutions in America hold up sufficiently to be able to pull this off? To pull off this election, to be able to do this election. And I do believe that the American institution, if you listen to President Trump, when they asked him the question, are you writing a concession speech, a victory speech? And he made a point that he said, it's great to win, but it's very hard to lose. That was, I think, surprising to me, because I haven't really heard that kind of tone from him. And maybe he realizes he may lose. So again, very unpredictable. Will we know tonight? If we know something tonight. Maybe if it's a landslide, we'll know it. But most likely with all of these mailing rules and these litigations, we won't know for a few days. But we could be wrong.
And it's, as you say, it's interesting to hear even Donald Trump hedging his bets, just speaking just now. We'll see where that goes. Now, just There's obviously, as you've mentioned, there's likely to be some form of litigation coming on in the coming days. There's already been litigation in the last few days. Even in Houston, was it 270,000 votes were allowed to the drive-by votes were allowed to continue. So I think I had that number too high. It's 127,000. Anyway, it's a large number of votes.
Texas is a very big state.
Indeed.
I've been there.
But in American law, this is something I'm familiar with. Does the idea of precedence carry? This isn't the first time there's been an election in the United States. There's experience of previous elections. In the previous elections, it hasn't been called on the election day. So, is it realistic for any litigants to say, "Hey, the election should finish on the 3rd of November," because it hasn't finished in the past on the polling day? So is that a legitimate thing to go to court about?
Well, the question is, who decides what the procedure should be? And as I said before, the Constitution placed the responsibility for organizing the elections in the hands of the state legislatures. So in the case in Wisconsin, that case involved, where the Supreme Court frowned on the federal judge saying you can extend it, because it's not the state legislature. And in Pennsylvania, it's the state court. So it's kind of a question of federalism and the interrelationship between the states and the federal government. We don't have a unitary federal election for president. We have a series of elections for the electoral votes in all of the different states. So the answer about the law, I think the law will be based on the fact that the Supreme Court, and we have to be very clear on this, does not want, and this is kind of there's the number of doctrines, Purcell doctrine, other doctrines, they don't want to interfere and call and determine the election. Now, they don't want to do that.
Should they?
Because that's in the realm of the people. And actually, the Constitution does not provide for a right to vote. It's not in the Constitution. In other words, what I'm trying to get at is, of course, the Electoral College is provided for in the Constitution. But state law determines how elections take place. Now, what happened in 2000 with Bush versus Gore is that the Supreme Court actually stepped in, right, and said, okay, no recount, and Bush won. So people perceive, many Americans perceive, that the Supreme Court called the election, determined the election, and made a decision on the election. So this is the problem, I think, if this now goes to litigation and becomes a legal issue. The Supreme Court, and particularly Chief Justice Roberts, who is very concerned about the prestige and reputation of the Supreme Court, will be very concerned about being blamed or indicating that the Supreme Court is now stepping in to second guess what is in effect the decision of the people and the state legislatures. This is very, very risky. Now, about precedent, yes, there are, of course, cases that the Supreme Court has decided, but the one thing about the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court is not bound by precedent. It's not bound by precedent. It can overturn its own precedent. So here we have, and I absolutely, on gerrymandering, which is the redistricting on certain political issues, the Supreme Court says, this is a political question. I'm not getting into this issue. Now, obviously, it's the interest of society that we should not be left in limbo and float around and not know who the president is. Now, to go to Inauguration Day and not have a president would be terrible. We have a procedure for that, too. The Speaker of the House becomes president. But can you imagine that? I mean, it would be mind-boggling and bizarre. So the idea is to try to use the institutions that we have to work with them in order to divine and decide a reasonable solution to this, which, by the way, at the end of the day, part of the country is going to be unhappy and part of the country is going to be unhappy, no matter how it turns out. But that's democracy.
And it's inevitable.
Yes, exactly. But about the court will be very, very careful not to call this election, determine this election, because then the accusation will be the Supreme. Now, remember who's on the Supreme Court, and here is the point of notice, right? We used to have, we have a conservative majority. Yes, we did. But Roberts could shift back and forth, and he went with the liberals on Obama health care, but now you've got 6 conservatives and 3 liberals. You've got Amy Coney Barrett, and and there was the whole question was brought up in the Senate Judiciary Committee was, hey, you're going on the court now. If something comes up on the election, what are you going to do? And she basically didn't answer the question. Now, clearly, I believe that as a judge, she's going to apply the law, and that is the way a judge is supposed to function. But the perception of it is what it is. The perception is the court is completely conservative. It's not even conservative in the point of 5-4. It's super conservative, and that's what Justice Roberts has to deal with, because he will not, on Obamacare, he cast the deciding vote and upheld Obamacare, right, by saying it was a tax. And that was an extraordinary decision, but he did it because I think in part he's right on the law and wrong on the law, but he didn't want the Supreme Court to be basically lowered in its reputation and its prestige in society. So if this comes up now, we're going to have another Florida-type situation like we did in 2000 with Bush versus Gore. The Supreme Court will have to tread very, very carefully and very, very lightly in terms of coming out and saying, you win, you lose. Because the last time they did it in 2000, their reputation was diminished tremendously in American society. Yeah. It is, again, we have 3 branches. We have executive, legislative, and judicial. They're coordinate branches. And the truth of the matter is they should check and balance each other. But when it comes to the American people exercising their democratic right to vote, that, again, the Constitution didn't place in the hands of the federal government. It placed it in the state legislatures. So that's a question of states' rights. And that becomes a complicated kind of a balancing test that the Supreme Court has to be very, very careful about. We've already seen some of these cases that have come up with the court, and they're treading very lightly on them, although some of the judges, I think on the dissent in the Wisconsin case, Justice Kagan had a very strong dissent. So but they're in the minority on the court. So it's going to call for courage by the conservatives, I believe. Of course, you do have some of the more conservative, right-wing conservatives, but you have Roberts. And Roberts, I think, has done an excellent job. By the way, the case that's coming up on Obama health care on November 10th, I would be shocked if they overturned Obama health care. I mean, of course, it depends who wins this election.
Indeed.
If Biden wins this election, right, and they turn down and overturn Obama health care, then the Democrats, I believe, will try to, quote, pack the court and add more judges. That would be so disappointingly, in a way, upsetting, because the system has operated with 9 judges. FDR tried to pack the court after the New Deal when the court didn't approve his New Deal legislation. He proposed to pack the court where each judge who reached a certain age could be replaced, and suddenly the Supreme Court started approving his legislation. So he never had to pack the court. This idea of packing the court is very problematic, A, for the reputation of the Supreme Court, but B, because the American people, I don't think, will tolerate it. In other words, we want an interaction in a democratic society. We don't want conflict. We don't want intimidation at the polls. We want people to be able to vote freely and express themselves. The Electoral College also, not just the Supreme Court, has come into some reputational challenge where Americans are saying, well, why are we doing it that way? Why don't we just have a popular vote? So a lot of things are being questioned and looked at. So this election, and actually I think it was either The Economist or Foreign Policy Magazine said this was the most important election ever. And in a sense, it is, because a lot is at stake. And I think it's the reputation of American democracy that's really at stake here. And can we get through this in a way that's democratic, or can we get through it where we're, floundering? That to me is the litmus test of this election. And hopefully we'll get through it. I think we will.
And that's a very interesting point, that it's opening up conversations that maybe been held by some groups in the past, but I think it's opening up conversations across America that probably haven't been held ever before. And certainly the world is becoming very much more aware of how things work in the United States. But again, as you say, perception is everything as regards the Supreme Court, and it needs to stay away from politics. Well, of course, today isn't just about the presidential election. There are also the various seats in the Senate being up for election today. Any comments on that?
Well, I mean, just from the civics point of view, the whole House is up every 2 years, but
Right.
the chances of the Republicans taking the House now, I don't think are very strong. And but miracles do happen. It has happened. The Republicans had the House and they lost it. But in the Senate, there are a number of seats that are wavering, including Lindsey Graham's seat, who is the chairman of Judiciary Committee, who has been the strongest advocate for President Trump. So the number of seats there, I think right now the majority is 53 to 47. That's a very tenuous majority. If you lose a little, I think you lose 2 or 3, you're sunk. You lose the majority. Now what you could end up with, who knows? American politics can sometimes be unpredictable. The House could go Democratic, the Senate could go Democratic, and President Trump could pull out a victory, and then you would have gridlock. Or you would have the Senate going Democratic, the House will be Democratic, and Biden wins the presidency, and now the Democrats control the whole government, but the Supreme Court is controlled by, or not controlled by, but has a majority that is staunchly conservative. Now, a lot of talk among Democrats, which is, if we win the House and we win the Senate and we win the presidency, what are we going to do about the court? Now, wait 1 second. That's the whole idea of the system. The system is incredible in that way, in the sense that there's checks and balances. So, the idea is not what is the key point here, and I think what has been lost in the last 4 years is a spirit of compromise. I mean, if you go back in American history and you look at the beginning at the Founding Fathers, I don't know how they did it. They put together this Constitution that is so complicated that you wouldn't have thought it would last. And Benjamin Franklin was at the Constitutional Convention, which was secret. And he took a stroll one day, and this lady, Mrs. Powell, saw him, and she said to him, Dr. Franklin, he was a doctor because I guess he invented the lightning rod, or he was a scientist. Dr. Franklin, what are you doing in there? What are you doing? What are you making? And he said, we're making a republic if you can keep it. A republic if you can keep it. And this, to me, is the message for this election, right? It's a republic, but it doesn't have to be a republic of majority rule, where one party decides everything. It has to be an interplay, and there has to be compromise. The example that I always give is the compromise between Ronald Reagan, Republican, and Tip O'Neill, Congressman, Speaker of the House, Democrat. These guys didn't agree on most things, right? But at the end of the day, they'd sit together, they'd meet at a restaurant, they'd have dinner, they just got together as friends. So we've lost that. Scalia, very right-wing. Justice Ginsburg, very liberal. But you know what? They were the best of friends. The best of friends. They traveled together. They went to the opera together. There's even an opera called Scalia-Ginsburg. Where did we lose this connection between the different parties where the people can actually be friendly and work together and disagree ideologically? Yes, that's fine. But what we're seeing is this idea that majority rule is a good thing. It isn't a good rule. Now about the filibuster and the cloture, the bottom line, without going through the details of it, historically, in order to get a nominee for the Supreme Court, you needed 60 votes in the Senate, which is a supermajority, which meant you had to compromise and had to have both parties agree on the nominee. They got rid of that. Okay, it's a long story how they got rid of it, but the bottom line is they should have gotten together and had 60 votes, and then both parties should pick a nominee, not just the one party that has the majority at that point in time gets to make all the decisions. That is not a democracy. A democracy is there's a majority, there's a minority, but on certain key issues, the rule still applies for a bill in the Senate. You have to have 60 votes, which is you can't get unless you have both parties. If you don't have that compromise, then you have people walking out and people not participating. The whole idea is to have a vibrant democracy, but with compromise. If you look at the Constitution, it's a spirit of compromise, and nobody compromises today. It's either my party wins or your party wins. What about the American people? What about America? So Who's going to be the loser here if this goes south? Who's going to be the loser if this election becomes a whole muddle and confusion? The American people will be the loser. And it's incumbent upon our leaders to make sure that America can get through this and the pandemic and the world too, of course, without sacrificing our principles, which should be based on compromise. And we don't hear enough of it today, I don't think.
Well, what about, I agree with you that there needs to be more compromise, but it's very interesting. One of the very interesting things that's happening in this election cycle is that Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, Joe Biden is the Democrat nominee, and yet there are many lifetime Republicans and people that have been part of the Republican Party, I think maybe still are, that are saying, vote Biden. What's happening here? Is this splitting the Republican Party? Is this what's going on?
Look, when Reagan ran for president, there were Democrats for Reagan. This happens all the time. It's just not a monolithic society here. If people are disabused by or not in support of a president's policies, they can respectfully, and I say respectfully, disagree. But it's not always here. It's not always been respectful. And I think that it's also the civic discourse, and it's also a matter of respect. Now, when that respect is absent, that's problematic. Now, in terms of Republicans who have shied away from President Trump as the leader of the Republican Party, they may have some points that are valid points about some of the policies that the president has pursued. I think the key issue is really not so much about Republican ideology. I think the key issue is about the handling of the pandemic. And that, to me, is not a political party issue. It's how the president has handled the pandemic. And his grade, I'm a professor, so I'll give him a grade. What's your grade on handling it? And then Republicans and Democrats alike have had some qualms and have been unhappy with the way this has been handled. Okay? I don't think it's conducive to the president's success to state that he's going to fire Dr. Fauci in the second term. Okay? And so Dr. Fauci, to my mind, and it's my personal opinion, is the one person in this country that pretty much, for the most part, people respect, listen to, and take seriously what he has to say, and they will listen to him on the vaccines. If the president comes in and goes, I'm going to fire him, he's going to lose Republicans, as he's losing Democrats on that. That issue, I don't think is political parties. That's an issue of competence, confidence and confidence in the ability of the leader to take the country through this issue. And this is really a referendum on that. Right. And also the economy, if you think about it, President Trump was doing great on the economy. Economy got smashed by COVID. So COVID really is the center of it. And even on foreign policy, when the president talks about China and the China virus and the China plague, that's also COVID and isn't really foreign policy. Because to use that terminology, to what effect and what end does that efficacious in foreign policy? It has no value. It just, again, heightens the issue and the problem for people. And it's a question, again, of the president's competence, confidence. And can Joe Biden have more competence and confidence to deal with this issue, since we're seeing spikes around the world, increases in the United States, and we want to give this person our vote of confidence. Can he handle this issue? So far, I think the grade on the handling of it is not a very good grade. Maybe a little bit overpassing, but not too much. So my point being that to me is the linchpin of the issue. I think if you ask people what they're interested in and why they're voting today, it's because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And in the middle of a pandemic, this issue has been heightened. People are unemployed because of the COVID. Economy, healthcare, all these issues are exacerbated. But it's all about, will this leader be able to protect us, and we have confidence, and is that leader competent? So the first debate between Biden and Trump was a real vote for, you're both incompetent and I have no confidence in you. The second debate was much better, and we started to feel that we had leaders, but question again, it's the president, how we vote on how he handled it. And Biden, we're going to vote on whether we think he'll be able to handle it. That's kind of where we are, and that's the juncture where America is right now, and that's what we're voting about. Other issues, I don't believe, again, I don't believe are really pertinent or essential, although there are a lot of other issues. The right has their issues, the left has their issues. They talk about Medicare for all and all these other things. Yeah, they're very, very important. But right now, we really need to get over the COVID and really need to get a vaccine so we can go back to normal and actually walk out of the house and go, in my case, to hug my grandchildren, which I haven't done for 7 months. And, this is very simple human nature, and people need jobs, and the economy needs to be built up. Who can do that better? Can Biden do it, or can Trump in his second term help to fix this situation? And that's, to me, confidence and competence. And that's what it's all about. And everything else is completely secondary. And so, again, with the confusion of the voting that we talked about, that just adds to people's concern about this, about their confidence in the future. And that is very, very telling. And that's why I think that the outpouring of voters is so great, because people feel they're in a crisis and want to do something about it. And they feel that by voting, they will be able to have their say. So that's I think where we are.
It's fascinating to see an election process which is even more about the individuals, about the personalities, rather than about the issues, as you say, having been overturned with COVID. I think it's a very valid point. Now, it's early afternoon, I think, on the East Coast and late morning on the West Coast. So the polling day, the election day itself, is not quite halfway through. When do the polls close at different times, of course, in different states? I guess they carry on until the evening times. Turnout today has been fairly calm, if busy, I believe. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, first of all, I actually have the closing times. I'll give you one or two states. So Texas is 10 p.m., Nevada 10 p.m., but North Carolina 7:30 p.m., 8 p.m. in Florida. So it's 8, 9, 10. That's kind of where it's at. So it's all over the place. I think in New York it's 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. And once they close the polls, then the next step is, the process of, actually processing the data. Now, in the states that have the electronic scanners, I had a student who was voting in one state, I can't remember which state it was, maybe it was Texas, who voted completely online. You actually went to the screen, you voted online. In New York, we vote with a ballot in which we fill in a little hole in the ballot for each candidate, and then it's placed in a scanner. Now,
so actually, I'm going to have to cut you off there, Mark. So the polls are going ahead, and we're looking forward to finding out what America's going to teach us later on today and into tomorrow. Thank you so much. We worked you hard this evening. Thank you for joining us today, Mark.
It was a pleasure, Randy.
Thank you.
Thank you.